All right, so today we're jumping into a piece of commentary from Davis Hanson, and it's really interesting because he lays out two big and actually very different arguments. First, we're going to look at his take on the strategy for dealing with Iran, and then we're going to pivot completely and look at his critique of how media narratives get shaped right here at home. So the whole thing kicks off with this incredibly blunt assessment of Iran's current situation. I mean, wow. This quote really sets the stage for his entire first argument, which is basically that the United States is operating from a position of just overwhelming strength. So here's our roadmap. First, we'll unpack this idea of Iran being internally weak and the U.S. strategy that, according to the source, stems from that. Then we'll make that big shift in focus to the domestic side and look at the alleged patterns in media narratives. Okay, so let's dive into this first part. The core argument here isn't just that Iran is weak on the outside, but that it's fundamentally broken on the inside. The commentary argues that you can't really talk about one single Iranian government. Instead, the picture painted is one of a constant power struggle between four competing groups. You've got the regular military, the theocracy, the very powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, and then the elected politicians. And the idea is that each one has its own agenda and, frankly, is deeply suspicious of the others. So what's the result of all this internal fighting? Well, the source uses a really strong word, schizophrenia. The idea is that one day you might see the government making moderate-sounding statements to the rest of the world. But then the very next day, they might do something incredibly aggressive. Why? Well, according to this view, it's to prove to the hardliners back home, like the IRGC, that they aren't going soft. This internal tug-of-war is what supposedly makes their actions seem so erratic. Okay, so if Iran is in this state of alleged internal chaos, what does that mean for U.S. strategy? The argument is that the U.S. doesn't have to negotiate in a traditional sense. It's actually in a position to dictate the terms. And what's the main tool for this dictation? It all comes down to money, specifically immense economic pressure. The source highlights this number right here, a reported $430 million a day. That's the amount of money Iran is supposedly losing in oil revenue every single day. And the argument is simple. When you're bleeding that much cash, time is absolutely not on your side. Now, according to this analysis, the actions taken weren't just random. They followed a very deliberate three-step sequence. Step 1, take their military and nuclear capabilities off the table. Step 2, offer to talk, but only from that new position of strength. And then Step 3, apply the economic screws with a blockade to basically force them to the table. And to really justify this aggressive approach, the speaker pulls out a pretty heavy historical parallel. He draws the direct line to the end of World War II. The argument is that, just like the U.S. dictated the terms of unconditional surrender to a defeated Japan and Germany, it's now in a similar position to do the same with what's being described as a prostrate Iran. So it's not framed as a negotiation between equals, it's framed as setting the terms of a surrender. All right, now we need to do a complete 180. The analysis makes a really sharp pivot here. We're moving away from international strategy and turning our focus inward to the domestic landscape, specifically to a critique of what the speaker calls the democratic media nexus. So what is this democratic media nexus? Well, understanding this term is pretty crucial because it's the bedrock for this entire second half of the commentary. The argument, essentially, is that this nexus is a kind of alliance that manufactures public figures, building them up into something they're not. So to back up this claim, the commentary points to what it sees as a clear, repeating pattern, where public figures are created and propped up by a manufactured narrative. And here are some of the key examples given in the source material. The argument is that in all these cases, a specific favorable narrative was constructed that was supposedly at odds with reality. You know, from promoting Jussie Smollett's story to presenting Michael Avenatti as a serious presidential contender or casting Stormy Daniels in the role of a working mom. The critique here is that these narratives were manufactured, pushed, and then eventually abandoned. So the big conclusion to this entire line of argument is that this alleged pattern is basically a house of cards. The narratives are presented as being so far removed from the actual facts that they just can't last. They're destined to collapse, and in the process, the public figures at the center of them implode. So let's just step back and recap the two distinct and pretty provocative arguments we've just walked through. The first is a geopolitical claim that the U.S. can and should dictate terms to an internally fractured and financially crippled Iran. And the second is a domestic critique, this idea of a media pattern that manufactures and then abandons flawed public figures. And all of this leaves us with one final big question to think about. The analysis presents these two arguments as separate issues, but you have to wonder, is there a connection? How might the stories a country tells about itself, at home, end up influencing or being influenced by the way it decides to act on the world stage?